If you listen to Russian propaganda, Ukraine's fall is inevitable. Donetsk is on the brink of collapse, and with that fall, Russia could push deeper into central Ukraine and onto victory. Vladimir Putin needs the world to believe those lies. His entire supposed peace proposal depends on it. But what Russia says and how it's really doing are two very different things. The reality is that Putin has destroyed Russia for just 0.97% of Ukraine since the initial days of his special military operation. Over 1 million Russian soldiers have become casualties of a war that has seen Russia grab barely any of Ukraine. That's according to Deep State, which published a report on August 18th highlighting just how tiny Russia's gains over the last 3.5 years have been. Reported by the Kyiv Independent, those figures paint a pretty ugly picture for Putin. After making significant gains during the first 3 weeks of the invasion, the Russian rate of advance has slowed to such a crawl that it's only managed to snatch up 2,255.6 square miles of Ukraine since November 2022. Before that, Russia's initial invasion, followed by several months that saw Ukraine scrambling to build up weapon stockpiles, aided the Russian advance. Between February and November of 2022, about 41,950 square miles of Ukraine fell to Russian occupation. That's a rate of advance of about 4,661 square miles per month, though the average doesn't reflect the fact that the majority of Russia's early advance happened during the first couple of months of the war, after it had caught Ukraine by surprise. There have been 32.5 months since that initial spurt of occupation. Dividing 2,255.6 square miles by 32.5 months gives a rate of advance of just 69.4 square miles per month. That's 67 times lower than the monthly average seen up to November 2022, and it tells us that Russia's grinding invasion, which Putin is so keen to claim is on the verge of breaking Ukraine, has barely achieved any results at all. United 24 Media reported on Deep State's figures, adding a quote from the analysts. Since then, the Russian army has kept pushing, and there's been no serious advance, the analysts said of the period from November 2022, meaning that Russia still only controls about 20% of Ukraine after around 3.5 years of brutal warfare. The pathetic territory occupation numbers are bad enough, but then there are the people. 1,071,780 of them as of August 19th, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. That's how many Russian soldiers Putin has sacrificed to death, injury, or capture since he launched his full-scale invasion. We've already mentioned that this means that over 1 million Russian casualties are the price that has been paid for 0.97% of Ukraine. If we take just the base totals, the averages don't seem so bad for Russia. 44,205.6 square miles of Ukraine in exchange for 1,071,780 is still a massive rate of attrition. It works out to about 24 soldiers per square mile of territory gained. Again, not great, but if Russia had maintained its early pace, it would be close to overrunning Ukraine by now. But those numbers are deceiving. The period between February and November 2022 accounts for 41,950 of the 44,205.6 square mile total, leaving just the 2,255.6 square miles we mentioned earlier. And when it comes to casualties, Russia has been losing more soldiers in the latter part of the Ukraine war than it did during the early stages. Precise figures are tough to come by, however. We do have a report dated November 10, 2022 from Al Jazeera that quotes retired US General Mark Milley as claiming that Russia had lost 100,000 of its soldiers. That number roughly aligns with the period of Russia's initial and far more successful invasion. So let's subtract 100,000 from 1,071,780 to get 971,780. That's approximately how many soldiers Russia lost in Ukraine between the end of November 2022 and today. For the paltry 2,255.6 square miles it's gained during the same period, suddenly the monthly average starts to look absolutely terrible. From 24 soldiers per square mile, if we take the base totals as given, the average number of Russian casualties per square mile gained since November 2022 rockets up to a staggering 431. That is insane. And it showcases both Putin's callous disregard for the soldiers that he's sending to die in the Ukraine war meat grinder, as well as Russia's complete ineptitude when coming up with a new strategy that would help it to avoid these types of losses. So we have the headline stats: 0.97% of Ukraine gained since November 2022, a staggering 971,780 soldiers lost to get that territory, the casualty rate of 430.4 soldiers per square mile gained. The big question now is also the most obvious: why? Part of the answer lies in the fact that many commentators back in February 2022 didn't believe that Putin would invade Ukraine. There were more than enough warning signs, and Ukraine was rightly wary, as The Atlantic said in January 2022. But the rest of the world, particularly the United States and much of Europe, didn't think Putin would take the drastic step that he eventually took. Sure, he might try to pull something like the campaign of aggression that saw Russia steal Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, but a full-blown invasion? That wasn't going to happen. Even as Russia was amassing troops in Crimea, Belarus, and the border territories to Ukraine's north, the collective West was reluctant to do or say anything about it. Josep Borrell provides the basic thought, at least in Europe, in the build-up to Putin's invasion. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, or RFE-RL, quotes Borrell as claiming that he received a phone call from former US Secretary of State Antony Blinken on February 22, 2022. Tony Blinken phoned me and told me, well, it's going to happen this weekend, and certainly 2 days later at 5 o'clock in the morning, they started bombing Kyiv. We did not believe this was going to happen. That belief hurt Ukraine massively. It was already sounding the alarm bells. Warnings were also coming from the UK and US intelligence communities, though nobody who really mattered. Putin was allowed to amass around 175,000 soldiers for his initial invasion without anybody standing in his way. Ukraine had to fend for itself with its fairly limited Soviet-era equipment and a far smaller army and groups of territorial fighting groups than it has today. Russia's initial rapid advance owed everything to the West not taking all of these warnings seriously, and it was only after Ukraine managed to push back this initial advance and military aid started pouring in from the West that we started to see a turnaround. From rapid forward momentum during the early months of the war, Russia's forces had been slowed to a crawl by November 2022. The emergence of drones as a major factor in the war aided Ukraine's defense, as did the revelation that Russia was something of a paper tiger, relying on large quantities of poorly trained troops and outdated equipment. Russia's advance slowed because Ukraine and eventually the West offered far more resistance than Putin anticipated. Makes you wonder if Russia would have been able to make any progress at all if the West had stepped up earlier, when the warnings of a pending invasion first came in. So the special military operation, turning into a war in the first place, is part of the reason why Russia is suffering so many casualties for such little land. However, that isn't the only factor at play. Russia's strategy, once its initial invasion failed and found itself in a fight, has a lot to answer for when it comes to the country's slow rate of advance in Ukraine. The Russian way of war simply isn't working. That's according to a June article by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, which points out that Russia resorted to an attritional strategy after its initial invasion failed. On paper, it seems like that strategy should favor Russia. A war of attrition typically sees an invading nation try to wear down its opponent through sheer numbers, destroying defenses, equipment, and people piecemeal to eventually claim a victory. Attrition can also be used in a defensive capacity, as both Russia and Ukraine have proven. Force the invader to throw everything they have at a near immovable wall of defenses, and you attrit their equipment and manpower instead. Russia's war is all about attrition, as CSIS points out. Russia has used dismounted infantry, including human wave attacks and mechanized forces, to wear down and attrit Ukrainian lines by killing and wounding Ukrainian soldiers, destroying equipment, undermining morale, and otherwise targeting Ukraine's capacity to fight. The source says, add drone, missile, and bomb strikes into the mix, and you get a clear view of Russia's strategy. Wear Ukraine out until it eventually collapses. The problem is that collapse hasn't come. Russia never expected Ukraine to hold out as long as it has. Putin didn't think the West would come roaring in with billions of dollars of military aid, or that Ukraine would adapt so well with its focus on drones and its building of a defense industry that's now supplying soldiers with more than 40% of the weapons they're now using. Ukraine was supposed to crumble. Instead, defensive attrition took place, and Russia found itself throwing soldiers in their thousands against Ukrainian defenses that simply weren't breaking anywhere near as fast as Putin would have expected. The problem for Russia is that it's not just people that it's losing in Ukraine. The same Ministry of Finance that gave us Russia's total casualty rate earlier says that the country has lost over 23,000 armored fighting vehicles in Ukraine. More than 11,000 Russian tanks lie in ruins, as do over 31,600 artillery systems. As more equipment burns and Russia loses soldiers by the tens of thousands every month, it's only natural that the pace of advancement would slow down. Less military equipment or older equipment used to replace the modern units that have been destroyed decreases the power of attacks. Being forced to cycle new and barely trained recruits onto the front line because of staggering losses also makes Russia's offensives less effective. Russia was weaker than anybody thought it was when it launched its Ukraine invasion, and it's only grown weaker since because the Russian way of war has been turned on its head. This is attrition. It's just attrition happening to Russia, which Putin never expected. Of course, we can't ignore the third reason why Russia's rate of advancement is so slow. Ukraine itself has an awful lot to do with it, as CSIS notes in its report. Ukrainian forces have also imposed significant costs with their defense in depth in a war that has largely favored the defending side, CSIS says. Ukraine has used trenches, dragon's teeth, mines, and other barriers, along with artillery and drones, to attrit advancing Russian soldiers and vehicles. Ukraine's defense against Russia hasn't just been brave, it's been brilliant. Every step of the way, Ukraine has anticipated what Russia will do and countered. All of the ground-based defenses that CSIS mentions slow Russia's soldiers and vehicles, leaving them primed for assaults by artillery and the ever-present drones that now litter the Ukrainian battlefield. Ukraine makes it so that Russia has to fight tooth and nail for every foot that it manages to advance, and it has made nothing easy for Putin's forces during the invasion. Russia thought Ukraine would roll over and sacrifice its territory. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Outside of introducing tactical nuclear strikes into its strategy, there doesn't seem to be much more Russia can do about its slow rate of advance. And now that we've covered why these advances are so slow, let's move on to why that matters in terms of the war and Putin destroying Russia for the sake of his ego-fueled special military operation. In the most immediate sense, the slow rate of advancement combined with Russia's massive casualty rate matters because they contradict the picture Putin is trying to paint about Russia's situation in the war. The Kyiv Independent says that Putin has claimed Russia's forces are advancing along the entire contact line, with the New York Times adding that Russia's leader believes that his troops will soon break through Ukraine's defensive line. Putin needs the world, and particularly the US, to believe these claims for a simple reason. Russia wants Ukraine to cede territory as part of any future peace deal. In particular, Putin wants as much of the Donbass region as he can get his hands on, with the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk being priorities. Putin needs everybody to believe that the fall of these regions is an inevitability, as that belief could lead to the US and perhaps even other Western nations to place pressure on Ukraine to cede them. While it's true that Russia occupies most of Luhansk, Donetsk is very much up for grabs. Russia controls about 70% of the region, leaving 30% up for grabs. Putin won't admit it, however the reality is that he's backed his forces into a corner in Donetsk. At least that's according to the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW. Euronews reports that the ISW believes that it's impossible for Putin to claim all of Donetsk unless Ukraine lets it happen. Russia could only rapidly seize all of the Donetsk region if Ukraine concedes to Putin's demand and withdraws from it, the ISW says. Note the use of the word rapidly. Russia's rate of advance is anything but rapid. Yes, it's still possible that Russia could eventually take the Donetsk region, however, it would take years, not weeks, for that to happen, which is a shot to the heart of Putin's claims that Ukraine should cede territory. Why would it? Ukraine is still defending Donetsk, as it has been throughout the war, and Russia's slow rate of advance means that Putin simply doesn't have the leverage he needs to claim otherwise. Bear in mind that Russia launched a summer offensive that was supposed to solve this problem. That offensive involved a new front opening up in Sumy, which Russia dedicated about 50,000 soldiers, and a pair of fronts in Donetsk, both close to the key city of Pokrovsk. Those latter two fronts had 110,000 soldiers dedicated to them, and to be fair to Russia, its rate of advance sped up slightly during the summer. In July, the BBC reported that Russia's forces managed to seize 215 square miles of Ukraine in June, which was its biggest monthly gain in 2025. But 215 square miles isn't the literal thousands of square miles Putin needs to make his claims that Ukraine's defenses are on the verge of falling hold any water. Ukraine isn't crumbling. The summer offensive, though it gained some ground, has failed. Now let's look at the wider picture of the war. If Russia maintains the slow rate of advance we've seen since November 2022, it's going to take decades for Putin's forces to capture Ukraine. How many decades is a matter for debate. In July, RBC Ukraine said that according to The Economist, it will take Russia about 89 years. The BBC says the number is closer to 70 years, which is still a ridiculous timeline. And according to Euromaidan Press in May, a full occupation would take until 2256 and would cost Russia a staggering 101 million soldiers out of its population of about 144 million. As crazy as it may seem, the Euromaidan Press figure, which it says comes from a Forbes analysis, may be the most accurate. Ukraine's total territory amounts to 233,062 square miles. Russia occupies 44,205.6 square miles of that territory, leaving 188,856.4 square miles. Earlier, we worked out that Russia's monthly rate of advance is just 69.4 square miles. Multiply that by 12, and you get 832.8 square miles per year. 188,856.4 divided by 832.8 gives us 226.7 years. The Forbes figures Euromaidan Press reported on say 231 years, so these two numbers aren't far off. And if Forbes is accurate, you've just learned why Putin's war is going to destroy his country. Russia is already losing far too many people, and it can't afford to lose tens of millions. The country already lost 1.3 million of its people when Putin launched his war, with the Week saying that was the number who chose to leave Russia altogether in 2022. Many of these people were younger and well-educated, meaning they won't be contributing to Russia's future. Over 1 million more have been lost to the war. Even though most of those million aren't dead, they're either injured, many to the point where they can no longer work, or they're languishing in Ukrainian jails. Most of these losses are from Russia's male population, and that's another issue for Putin. The Week says that Russia's 2021 census already showed that the country had 10.5 million more women than men. The disparity is now much larger thanks to Putin throwing so many of Russia's men into the churn of the Ukraine war. Russia's war economy has also created competition between its military-industrial base and the rest of its business sectors for workers, which is going to cost Russia's economy massively when the war ends. Euronews spoke to CSIS senior fellow Maria Snegovaya about the issue. She said that Russia is on the verge of a labor crisis. The total number of emigrants since 2022 is estimated at around between 500,000 and 1 million people, many of whom are younger, better educated, and working in key industries such as the information technology sector, Snegovaya says of the Russians who left their country when Putin launched his invasion. Adding to that the mobilized and volunteers overall, due to a combination of coronavirus, mobilization, and war-related casualties from 2020 to 23, Russia's labor pool has lost about 1.9 to 2.8 million people. Decades more of the Ukraine war, which is what it will take for Russia to finally occupy all of Ukraine, simply isn't sustainable when there are problems like these at home. So Putin is making it all worse. In July, the BBC reported that Putin has repeatedly broken his promise not to call up Russia's 18-year-olds to serve in Ukraine. But in the past 2 years, the BBC says, its investigative team has discovered that at least 245 18-year-old soldiers have died in Putin's war. There are likely many more youngsters who are dead that the BBC didn't find, along with even more who are actively fighting as we speak. As the country crumbles under a labor crisis caused in part by the Ukraine war, Putin is leeching away at Russia's future as well. He has devolved into a vampiric force who seems intent on sapping away the very lifeblood of the country he claims to love above all else. And it's simply not working. It doesn't matter how many school leavers Putin sends into Russia's military. The plodding rate of Russia's advance means even those youngsters are going to be non-factors. Russia holds just 20% of Ukraine. It has another 80% to go, and the figures revealed on August 18th show us that it's never going to get there. And if it does, Putin will have destroyed Russia to make it happen. Russia certainly won't come closer to occupying all of Ukraine when its enemy is taking back land Russia thought it had claimed. We mentioned Pokrovsk earlier in the video, and that's just become the site of Russia's latest humiliation. Russia thought it had broken through in that city, but Pokrovsk is liberated, and Russia has just lost everything. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you, as always, for watching.